against Israel, mostly in Lebanon, there arose the need for actual humanitarian contacts between the two sides. So armed conflict moved to the Lebanon area of operations between the PLO and Israel, but there were civilians caught in the middle, of course. And there were also other humanitarian aspects, including the return of those missing in action, of prisoners of war, and of the remains of fallen fighters from both sides. And this drove both the PLO and the Israelis to seek out quiet contacts with each other. Of course, the political situation was terrible. There was ongoing settlement, ongoing occupation, direct violence against an unarmed population, lots of disproportionate use of force, contravening the Geneva Conventions, creation and use of proxy forces. Israel created the SLA in Lebanon and supported the Phalange in Lebanon as well. Iran began supporting Hezbollah later on after the Lebanese Civil War. And there was an inability by the Israelis early on to engage in a meaningful way with Hamas while also weakening the Palestinian Authority, which of course opened up opportunities for Hamas and Islamic Jihad to rise in terms of power and influence among the Palestinian population. But the early 80s did present some opportunities for Israel and the Palestinians to engage in direct contacts, very quiet. Bizarrely, usually these were done by the Likud party, the right-wing party, the former right-wing party in Israel. But later they were assumed and taken over by folks in the Labor Party. In 1996, there was an understanding between Israel and Hezbollah that was brokered by the United States and monitored by the United States, France, the UN, and the Lebanese armed forces that led to, shall we say, a de-civilianization of the conflict on the northern border of Israel, southern border of Lebanon. And this was, for me, an interesting example of how the parties could find that little sweet spot between not ending their hostilities against each other, but removing some of the more dire civilian costs to their conflict. And there was constant back and forth between the Israelis and the proxies, the Syrians, who were present at the monitoring talks every week from 1996 onward, to make sure that their armed conflict remained a conflict between belligerents and not a conflict against civilians. Of course, the rest of the history, the track record of the parties is replete with civilians being in the middle of armed conflict and themselves being the battleground in a sense. So POW, MIA, and humanitarian interests did seem to drive the PLO and the Israelis closer together, but eventually, 9 years after the initial contacts between Israel and the PLO, led to those secret negotiated talks that the Norwegians helped to mediate, the so-called Oslo peace process. And this proceeded on for about 15 years before it finally petered out with no concrete outcome and a reversal of all the progress that had been made, leading to the situation that we have today. And this is unfortunate because it was humanitarian contacts and interests that led the parties to explore a cessation of hostilities, but then take advantage of the cessation of hostilities to pursue comprehensive peace talks. It's a part of the research that I do as an academic to look at the connection between ceasefire negotiations and comprehensive peace. Ceasefires, as most of you will know here, are remarkably fragile. They take very high-level resources to negotiate, but they can be undone by the lowliest belligerent who has bad faith and wants to upset the party's political balances. And their fragility lends itself to some thinking about how to consolidate them, how to make them more durable. But the fact is, they can never be fully durable. There are a couple of cases, of course, of long-lasting ceasefires. There is a ceasefire between the two Koreas, for example, that has lasted decades, but it's always a potential flashpoint. The underlying political conflict is what needs to be ultimately addressed. For governments, the ceasefire is always an opportunity to resupply and rearm, to take a tactical pause with the least disadvantage on the battlefield. But for the non-state armed group, a ceasefire is a way to freeze the gains made by either side or to halt the losses. But for non-state armed groups, losses can be framed positively as sacrifice, which is, usually not the case for the legitimate governments and for state armed forces. For civilians, a ceasefire is about harm reduction and protection. So these are quite non-overlapping interests in ceasefires. So I'd say that the interests by governments, by non-state armed groups, and civilians in ceasefires really do not match. And it takes real third-party coordination and possibly even coercion to get a ceasefire not only consolidated, but moving towards a future in which cooperation and some sort of peaceful settlement is possible. There are some additional negative dynamics to the current situation, but I think they're quite obvious to everybody who's an observer. It seems to me that this is one of those conflicts in which past aggressive actions by each side serve not to moderate the parties, but to incline the parties to believe that they cannot pursue trust-building efforts with each other. And as we know from history, there is no, the earlier you start to try to build trust, the better. And trust can be built even after the most heinous of situations. But somebody has to start. And we have situations like the current one in which there is no trust building. There only seems to be an interest by the international community, particularly by Qatar and the United States, in a small humanitarian pause rather than an actual opening towards comprehensive peace. I'll conclude my remarks there and hope that there is some interesting questions that my remarks may have inspired or stimulated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your enlightening work, Anthony. It was really, really awesome to listen to you. We will maintain